You are drifting now, quietly, into the hum of a city that never sleeps. The air is heavy, not with the scent of danger yet, but with the promise of rhythm. It's Harlem, sometime in the late 1920s, that peculiar between moment when the decade's roar had begun to soften, but before the world realized it was teetering on the edge of collapse. You can almost hear it, faintly beneath the chatter, the syncopated heartbeat of a trumpet, the low murmur of a bass, the whisper of feet sliding across worn wooden floors. This was not the Harlem of skyscrapers or quiet brownstones. This was a Harlem alive with sound. The Great Migration had brought thousands of black families northward, their dreams wrapped in cloth and carried on trains that left southern soil behind. They came to escape the tight grip of sharecropping, of Jim Crow laws, of long days spent beneath the sun. In Harlem, they found a different kind of heat, one that pulsed from jazz clubs, speakeasies, and rent parties that lasted until dawn. Rent parties were essential to survival. You might imagine a dimly lit apartment, wallpaper peeling slightly at the corners, furniture pushed up against the walls. The smell of frying fish wafts through the air, and the piano in the corner is slightly out of tune. People would come, pay a small fee at the door, 25 cents, maybe 50, to dance, drink, and forget that tomorrow meant rent was due. Musicians would play for hours, sweating through their collars, improvising melodies that no one would ever hear again. For many, it was the only way to keep the landlord away for one more week. But beneath that rhythm, something else began to move quietly through the neighborhood. Slower, quieter, almost invisible. Heroin. It had come from Europe, imported under sterile names and sold in apothecaries long before anyone thought to call it dangerous. The Bayer Company, the same one that made aspirin, once marketed it as a remedy for coughs. The irony was unintentional but perfect, a cure for a cough that could silence you forever. By the 1930s, the drug had drifted into the undercurrents of Harlem's nightlife. No one quite remembers when it started. Perhaps a drummer who couldn't sleep after a set, or a trumpet player whose nerves burned before stepping on stage. Heroin promised stillness. It promised relief from the constant vibration of the city, and in a place where noise never stopped, silence could feel like luxury. The Harlem Renaissance had been built on the energy of newness, new art, new voices, new black identity. Writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston wrote of the joy and pain of living. Musicians like Duke Ellington and Bessie Smith captured the sound of that struggle in brass and melody. But by the early 1930s, the Renaissance had begun to fray at the edges. The Great Depression reached into Harlem too, like a hand that pulled away opportunity. Rent parties became more desperate, clubs grew smaller, wages disappeared. The music still played, of course, but it sounded different, more melancholy, slower, as if the horns themselves were weary. In this exhaustion, heroin found fertile ground. It was no longer a fashionable indulgence of the wealthy, but a cheap escape for the working poor. An envelope of powder, a spoon, a needle. Relief for a few hours. There were patterns that repeated themselves quietly, almost invisibly, across the city. A young trumpet player would begin to show up late to rehearsals, his eyes a little heavier each night. A singer's voice would tremble more often, her laughter a beat too loud. Friends would whisper about someone they hadn't seen in weeks. And the police, often indifferent, sometimes complicit, would shrug. To them, Harlem was already another world, one where jazz and vice were inseparable. In the small apartments of Lenox Avenue and 135th Street, mothers worried quietly. They had come north so their children might live better lives, and yet the city seemed to find new ways to break them. Heroin was not loud like gin or wild like the speakeasy. It was quiet. It crept into lives softly, almost politely. By the time it was noticed, it was too late. There is a strange irony here, too. Heroin at that time was still considered a white drug. In the early years of America's narcotic legislation, the government's fear had been aimed elsewhere, at opium dens in Chinatown, at cocaine myths surrounding black laborers in the South. When heroin began appearing in Harlem, it did not immediately alarm the authorities. It was treated as a medical problem, not a moral panic. It wasn't until addiction began to spread through the jazz world, a world that crossed racial lines and traveled on records and tours, that policymakers began to worry. And even then, their concern was often less about saving lives than about protecting reputations. In the small clubs that dotted Harlem, the Cotton Club, the Savoy Ballroom, Small's Paradise, the contrast was stark. Upstairs, the music shone bright and clean, brass catching the light of chandeliers. Downstairs in the basements, shadows lingered. Musicians rested between sets, wiping sweat from their faces, and in the dim light, a different kind of ritual unfolded. A belt, a needle, a sigh, the music of the veins. There was a certain logic to it, if you listened long enough. Jazz demanded everything from its players. It was not written music, not really. It was felt, improvised, lived in the moment. The tempo changed without warning, and solos demanded both precision and passion. For the musicians who lived night to night, the strain was immense. Heroin offered a way to keep the nerves steady, to blur the edge between body and instrument. Many said it helped them play, and perhaps for a time it did. But slowly, it began to unmake them. Trumpet players lost their breath. Pianists lost their timing. Singers lost their voices. The disease of addiction was not yet understood as we know it now. It was seen as weakness, as failure. People whispered of dope fiends and junkies with disgust, not pity. There were no clinics in Harlem then, no methadone programs, no outreach. There was only the street, and the music, when one could still play it. Harlem's heroin problem was not isolated. Across New York, narcotics spread quietly among the disillusioned. Veterans from the Great War, immigrants without work, and those left behind by the collapse of Wall Street all found themselves turning toward the same escape. But in Harlem, the contrast between the brilliance of its art and the depth of its suffering made the tragedy feel sharper. It was as if the same rhythm that gave the world joy also carried within it a note of mourning. In 1932, newspapers began to take notice. Small articles appeared. Dupe in Harlem clubs. Narcotics agents make raid. The language was cold, impersonal. They spoke of seizures and arrests, of colored musicians found with paraphernalia, of women taken from apartments in handcuffs. But behind each headline were real people, men who once played in Duke's orchestra, women who once sang at the Cotton Club, now lost in the silence of withdrawal. What made it so insidious was how ordinary it became. The drug did not announce itself with violence or chaos, at least, not at first. It simply replaced sleep, then appetite, then work. Those who used began to move slower, talk less. Their eyes grew distant, their laughter brittle. Friends pretended not to notice, because noticing meant acknowledging how fragile the dream of Harlem really was. And yet, the music continued. That's the strange thing. Even in decline, Harlem's pulse never fully stopped. Some of its greatest performances came during those years, born from pain and desperation. Jazz was never meant to be clean or easy. It was a mirror reflecting both joy and despair in the same note. As you imagine this now, the dim rooms, the thin smoke curling toward the ceiling, the faint hum of a trumpet somewhere below street level, you might begin to wonder, how did something so beautiful, so full of life and creation, become tangled with something so destructive? How did the sound of freedom become intertwined with the quiet hiss of a needle? And in the years that followed, when the music grew darker and the city began to change again, who, if anyone, would manage to escape? You are drifting now, quietly, into the hum of a city that never sleeps. The air is heavy, not with the scent of danger yet, but with the promise of rhythm. It's Harlem, sometime in the late 1920s, that peculiar in-between moment when the decade's roar had begun to soften. But before the world realized it was teetering on the edge of collapse. You can almost hear it, faintly beneath the chatter, the syncopated heartbeat of a trumpet, the low murmur of a bass, the whisper of feet sliding across worn wooden floors. This was not the Harlem of skyscrapers or quiet brownstones. This was a Harlem alive with sound. The Great Migration had brought thousands of black families northward, their dreams wrapped in cloth and carried on trains that left southern soil behind. They came to escape the tight grip of sharecropping, of Jim Crow laws, of long days spent beneath the sun. In Harlem, they found a different kind of heat, one that pulsed from jazz clubs, speakeasies, and rent parties that lasted until dawn. Rent parties were essential to survival. You might imagine a dimly lit apartment, wallpaper peeling slightly at the corners, furniture pushed up against the walls. The smell of frying fish wafts through the air, and the piano in the corner is slightly out of tune. People would come, pay a small fee at the door, 25 cents, maybe 50, to dance, drink, and forget that tomorrow meant rent was due. Musicians would play for hours, sweating through their collars, improvising melodies that no one would ever hear again. For many, it was the only way to keep the landlord away for one more week. But beneath that rhythm, something else began to move quietly through the neighborhood. Slower, quieter, almost invisible. Heroin. It had come from Europe, imported under sterile names and sold in apothecaries long before anyone thought to call it dangerous. The Bayer Company, the same one that made aspirin, once marketed it as a remedy for coughs. The irony was unintentional but perfect, a cure for a cough that could silence you forever. By the 1930s, the drug had drifted into the undercurrents of Harlem's nightlife. No one quite remembers when it started. Perhaps a drummer who couldn't sleep after a set, or a trumpet player whose nerves burned before stepping on stage. Heroin promised stillness. It promised relief from the constant vibration of the city. And in a place where noise never stopped, silence could feel like luxury. The Harlem Renaissance had been built on the energy of newness, new art, new voices, new black identity. Writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston wrote of the joy and pain of living. Musicians like Duke Ellington and Bessie Smith captured the sound of that struggle in brass and melody. But by the early 1930s, the Renaissance had begun to fray at the edges. The Great Depression reached into Harlem, too, like a hand that pulled away opportunity. Rent parties became more desperate, clubs grew smaller, wages disappeared. The music still played, of course, but it sounded different, more melancholy, slower, as if the horns themselves were weary. In this exhaustion, heroin found fertile ground. It was no longer a fashionable indulgence of the wealthy, but a cheap escape for the working poor. An envelope of powder, a spoon, a needle. Relief for a few hours. There were patterns that repeated themselves quietly, almost invisibly, across the city. A young trumpet player would begin to show up late to rehearsals, his eyes a little heavier each night. A singer's voice would tremble more often, her laughter a beat too loud. Friends would whisper about someone they hadn't seen in weeks. And the police, often indifferent, sometimes complicit, would shrug. To them, Harlem was already another world, one where jazz and vice were inseparable. In the small apartments of Lenox Avenue and 135th Street, mothers worried quietly. They had come north so their children might live better lives, and yet the city seemed to find new ways to break them. Heroin was not loud like gin or wild like the speakeasy, it was quiet. It crept into lives softly, almost politely. By the time it was noticed, it was too late. There is a strange irony here, too. Heroin at that time was still considered a white drug. In the early years of America's narcotic legislation, the government's fear had been aimed elsewhere, at opium dens in Chinatown, at cocaine myths surrounding black laborers in the South. When heroin began appearing in Harlem, it did not immediately alarm the authorities. It was treated as a medical problem, not a moral panic. It wasn't until addiction began to spread through the jazz world, a world that crossed racial lines and traveled on records and tours, that policymakers began to worry. And even then, their concern was often less about saving lives than about protecting reputations. In the small clubs that dotted Harlem, the Cotton Club, the Savoy Ballroom, Small's Paradise, the contrast was stark. Upstairs, the music shone bright and clean, brass catching the light of chandeliers. Downstairs in the basements, shadows lingered. Musicians rested between sets, wiping sweat from their faces, and in the dim light, a different kind of ritual unfolded. A belt, a needle, a sigh. The music of the veins. There was a certain logic to it, if you listened long enough. Jazz demanded everything from its players. It was not written music, not really. It was felt, improvised, lived in the moment. The tempo changed without warning, and solos demanded both precision and passion. For the musicians who lived night to night, the strain was immense. Heroin offered a way to keep the nerves steady, to blur the edge between body and instrument. Many said it helped them play, and perhaps for a time it did. But slowly, it began to unmake them. Trumpet players lost their breath. Pianists lost their timing. Singers lost their voices. The disease of addiction was not yet understood as we know it now. It was seen as weakness, as failure. People whispered of dope fiends and junkies, with disgust, not pity. There were no clinics in Harlem then, no methadone programs, no outreach. There was only the street, and the music, when one could still play it. Harlem's heroin problem was not isolated. Across New York, narcotics spread quietly among the disillusioned. Veterans from the Great War, immigrants without work, and those left behind by the collapse of Wall Street, all found themselves turning toward the same escape. But in Harlem, the contrast between the brilliance of its art and the depth of its suffering made the tragedy feel sharper. It was as if the same rhythm that gave the world joy also carried within it a note of mourning. In 1932, newspapers began to take notice. Small articles appeared, dupe in Harlem clubs, narcotics agents make raid. The language was cold, impersonal. They spoke of seizures and arrests, of colored musicians, found with paraphernalia, of women taken from apartments in handcuffs. But behind each headline were real people, men who once played in Duke's orchestra, women who once sang at the Cotton Club, now lost in the silence of withdrawal. What made it so insidious was how ordinary it became. The drug did not announce itself with violence or chaos, at least not at first. It simply replaced sleep, then appetite, then work. Those who used began to move slower, talk less. Their eyes grew distant, their laughter brittle. Friends pretended not to notice, because noticing meant acknowledging how fragile the dream of Harlem really was. And yet, the music continued. That's the strange thing. Even in decline, Harlem's pulse never fully stopped. Some of its greatest performances came during those years, born from pain and desperation. Jazz was never meant to be clean or easy. It was a mirror reflecting both joy and despair in the same note. As you imagine this now, the dim rooms, the thin smoke curling toward the ceiling, the faint hum of a trumpet somewhere below street level, you might begin to wonder, how did something so beautiful, so full of life and creation, become tangled with something so destructive? How did the sound of freedom become intertwined with the quiet hiss of a needle? And in the years that followed, when the music grew darker and the city began to change again, who, if anyone, would manage to escape? The story of Harlem's heroin plague did not end in the 1930s. Like music, it carried its own rhythm, a slow, mournful tempo that stretched across decades. By the time the Second World War began, the streets had changed. The bright lights of the Renaissance had long since dimmed, and the laughter of rent parties had been replaced by the quiet tension of survival. War brought a strange kind of renewal. Harlem buzzed again. Soldiers in uniform, ration lines, a new sense of purpose. But beneath that movement, addiction still simmered, unseen by most and ignored by many. It lived in alleyways, in the back rooms of bars, and in the wary faces of musicians who once played until dawn but now sat silently, their hands still tapping rhythms only they could hear. Eddie, Sticks, Coleman, the drummer we met before, might have been among them. There are no records of him after 1938. He exists now only in memory, in the faint storylines whispered by those who remember the old days. A friend once said he went west, chasing work in Chicago. Another swore he died in the Bronx, alone in a boarding room. Both could be true. That was the way of it in Harlem then. People vanished slowly, quietly like smoke. But not everyone disappeared. Some fought back in small, unrecorded ways. By the early 1940s, community leaders in Harlem began to speak openly about the epidemic. Churches, social clubs, and small neighborhood associations organized meetings to discuss the problem. The Amsterdam News, Harlem's leading black newspaper, published editorials condemning not just the drug trade, but the city's neglect. The white press will call it our shame, one columnist wrote in 1941, but it is their silence that keeps it alive. The problem was visibility. To the rest of New York, Harlem was an entertainment district, a place to visit but not to understand. Wealthy white patrons still came to the Cotton Club, still applauded the music, still left tips on tables, but they did not see the decay behind the stage curtains. The musicians who played for them were often addicts. Not because they were immoral, but because they were exhausted. Jazz had always been a double-edged gift. It demanded everything. It required its creators to feel deeply, to live intensely, to play with heart and risk. But the world around them offered no protection, no wealth, no stability. The applause was loud, but the rent was still due. The lights dimmed, and the loneliness returned. By 1943, the situation had grown impossible to ignore. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics under Harry Anslinger ramped up arrests in Harlem. Anslinger's reports described Harlem as a center of contagion, filled with addicts, prostitutes, and corrupting music. His words were laced with racial fear, the belief that jazz and narcotics were tools of moral decay. He targeted musicians by name. Billie Holiday, Charlie Parker, and later, even Thelonious Monk found themselves hounded by federal agents. Billie Holiday's arrest in 1947 was particularly cruel. She had already survived more than most: abuse, poverty, racism. But her heroin addiction gave the government its excuse. She was arrested in her hospital bed, handcuffed while recovering from withdrawal. "They took my voice," she would later say, "and then they wanted my soul." The cycle was relentless. Artists used heroin to endure the pressure. The pressure destroyed them. The authorities punished the destruction. It was a closed loop designed to suffocate rather than heal. Meanwhile, Harlem itself was changing. The war brought new migrants from the south, searching for work in munitions plants and factories. Housing was scarce. Rents climbed. The once thriving cultural mecca began to resemble an overcrowded island. In such conditions, addiction spread easily, not just heroin now, but morphine, opium, and later methadone. Each generation inherited the silence of the last. Still, the music did not die, it transformed. The 1940s gave birth to bebop, a new and faster kind of jazz. It was intricate, cerebral, rebellious, a direct reaction against the swing music of the previous decade. Musicians like Charlie Bird Parker and Dizzy Gillespie created melodies that twisted through impossible scales, refusing to conform to expectations. Bebop was intellectual, even defiant, the sound of black artists claiming their complexity. But with it came a familiar pattern. Parker, one of bebop's founders, became its most tragic symbol. He played like no one before him, sharp, improvisational, and fearless, but he was also deeply addicted to heroin. His brilliance burned fast. By 1955, he was dead at 34, his body worn down by addiction and neglect. For many in Harlem, Parker's death was the closing note of a long, sorrowful symphony that had begun decades earlier in the basements of rent parties. What had once been a personal escape had become a generational wound. And yet, even in tragedy, Harlem refused to surrender. Community clinics began to open in the 1950s, quietly funded by local doctors and churches. They had few resources, but they listened. They offered what the city never had: empathy. There were no headlines for these small victories, but they mattered. They were the slow, patient acts of survival that history rarely remembers. Some of the old musicians found redemption, too. Louis Armstrong, still performing into the 1950s, became an elder statesman of jazz, his laughter and trumpet masking the pain of those he had outlived. Duke Ellington continued to compose, creating music that seemed to hold all the sorrow of Harlem and all its endurance in equal measure. They became living proof that art could transcend its suffering, even if it never escaped it. By the 1960s, Harlem's heroin epidemic had evolved into something larger, feeding into the broader struggles of urban America. The civil rights movement shifted national attention toward justice, but addiction remained a quieter war. In the streets where jazz had once reigned, another sound began to rise, the hard rhythm of drums and chants from protests, the early pulse of soul and funk. The city's music changed again, as it always did, but the ghosts of the 1930s lingered. If you walk those same streets today, 125th Street, Lenox Avenue, the edges of Sugar Hill, you'll still hear echoes. Not literal ones, perhaps, but resonances: a trumpet in a passing car, the laughter of someone playing an old record through an open window. Harlem remains alive, its history layered in sound and silence. The heroin plague of the 1930s was not just about addiction. It was about exhaustion, the fatigue of a community asked to give beauty to a world that refused to share its burdens. The musicians of that era created light, even as their own lives darkened. Their art was not just entertainment, it was endurance. Eddie Sticks Coleman may never have known that his drumming, his quiet persistence, his simple act of playing through the pain would become part of something larger. But it did. Every note, every performance, every fleeting rhythm became a record of survival. Harlem's music did not just tell its story, it preserved it. And in that preservation lies something remarkable. Even in decay, even in silence, Harlem's rhythm never fully stopped. As you drift towards sleep now, imagine that last image: a dimly lit club in 1930s Harlem. The smoke curls slowly toward the ceiling. The audience has gone. A single drummer sits behind his kit, his head bowed. He lifts the sticks one more time, strikes the snare once, softly, just enough to hear the echo fade. That echo still lives somewhere in the air above 135th Street. And perhaps if you listen closely enough, you'll wonder, did the music survive because of the pain or in spite of it? You find yourself once again in Harlem, the same streets but a different silence. It's the mid-1930s now, deep into the Great Depression. The music still drifts from doorways, but the laughter is thinner, the streets more tired. For every note of jazz that rings through the night, there's another sound beneath it. The quiet shuffle of business, of whispered deals in alleyways, of hands exchanging things best left unseen. This story is not about the music itself, but about the people who moved the substance that shaped it. The invisible network of sellers, runners, and suppliers who turned Harlem's heroin trade into one of the most complex underground economies of its time. To understand it, you must begin not in Harlem, but downtown, in the sterile offices of pharmaceutical companies. Even after the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914 made unlicensed distribution of opiates illegal, the system remained porous. Legitimate manufacturers continued to produce morphine and heroin for medical use. Pharmacies filled prescriptions that were sometimes real, sometimes forged. Corrupt doctors wrote those prescriptions freely, often to addicts who had the means to pay. And in the cracks between legality and desperation, an entire economy grew. By the 1930s, the heroin that reached Harlem had passed through many hands. Some of it was stolen from warehouses, some diverted by pharmacists who diluted it and resold the remainder. In other cases, Entire shipments disappeared en route from the docks. The city's waterfront, especially the Chelsea Piers and East River docks, became crucial transfer points. From there, the drug moved uptown, hidden in crates of food, furniture, even religious pamphlets. But the real heart of distribution lay within Harlem itself. Contrary to the sensational headlines of the day, there was no grand Negro crime syndicate controlling it. The truth was more mundane, more human. The trade functioned through informal networks, built on trust, fear, and survival. At the bottom were the runners, often teenagers, errand boys who carried small packets hidden in their socks or under collars. They earned a few dollars for each delivery, enough to buy food or contribute to the household rent. Above them were the street pushers, men and women who sold directly to users, often near clubs, alleys, or tenement stairwells. Some were addicts themselves, selling only to fund their own habits. These sellers were not the monsters the newspapers described. Many were victims of the same poverty that fueled the demand. They operated within a code, loose, unspoken, but binding. You didn't sell near schools. You didn't cheat musicians, and you didn't draw attention to yourself. Above them were the middlemen, often small, time hustlers who had enough money to buy in bulk, but not enough power to protect themselves. They dealt directly with Italian and Jewish suppliers downtown, who in turn had connections to the remnants of the Sicilian and Corsican heroin rings that smuggled the drug into the United States through Europe. These men, sometimes charming, often ruthless, understood Harlem as both opportunity and risk. It was profitable, yes, but unpredictable. The connections between Harlem's street sellers and the downtown syndicates were fragile. They depended on quiet cooperation and the unspoken rule that the trade stayed in the shadows. As long as Harlem's vice was contained within its own borders, the authorities turned a blind eye. The moment it spilled downtown, the raids began. Within Harlem, heroin was just one part of a larger underground economy that kept thousands alive. Bootlegging had already taught the neighborhood how to move contraband, how to hide it, sell it, and avoid the law. Many of the same people who once sold gin and whiskey during Prohibition simply switched products when alcohol became legal again. In that sense, the heroin trade was not an anomaly. It was a continuation of survival, but it was also a trap. The profits were small and the risks were enormous. Federal narcotics agents, new, ambitious, and under pressure from Anslinger's crusade, began to flood Harlem in the mid-1930s. They raided apartments, arrested teenagers, and filled the papers with images of confiscated syringes and crumpled foil packets. Each arrest was presented as a victory, yet for every pusher taken in, another appeared within days. Part of the reason was economic. There was no other work. The Depression had closed factories and shops. The domestic service jobs that once sustained Harlem's families, laundry, cooking, driving, had dried up. For many, selling heroin wasn't rebellion, it was survival. The language of the time reveals much. Dealers didn't talk about drugs. They spoke of stuff, medicine, horse. Addicts didn't say they were hooked. They said they were chasing the ghost. And in a community where most families had experienced displacement and poverty for generations, that ghost took on many forms: lost opportunity, lost dignity, lost peace. It would be easy to imagine the trade as chaotic, but in reality it was strangely ordered. Certain corners were controlled by certain sellers. Some apartment buildings were hot, meaning everyone inside was somehow connected. Lookouts on the stoop, stash rooms hidden behind false walls, coded knocks to announce visitors. The entire operation functioned like a nervous system, sensitive, responsive, invisible. One former addict, interviewed decades later, described it like this: "If you needed it, you didn't have to look far. The street would find you. Everybody knew somebody. You didn't have to ask loud, just stand on the right corner and the wind would bring it to you." But the trade also bred distrust. There were betrayals, informants, police extortion. Many officers used their power not to dismantle the network, but to profit from it. Bribes were common. Protection, money changed hands regularly. It was a delicate ecosystem of corruption that kept the machine running. At the same time, community leaders faced a painful contradiction. Harlem's churches and civic groups condemned the heroin plague, but they also recognized that many users and sellers were neighbors, family, friends. There was no clear enemy, no outsider to blame. The drug had become part of Harlem's own bloodstream, and the stigma was heavy. Addicts were often treated as moral failures rather than patients. Clinics were scarce, and white-run hospitals downtown frequently turned away black addicts. A quiet form of segregation existed even in suffering. They don't want us in their wards, one Harlem resident said, but they'll come up here to dance to our music. Through it all, the economy of heroin persisted because it filled a void that the legitimate world refused to fill. It offered income when no jobs existed, relief when no doctors cared, community when the city ignored Harlem entirely. It was, in a grim way, the mirror image of the legitimate economy, just as complex, just as structured, but born of neglect. There were a few who tried to change it. Ministers preached against addiction from pulpits. Women's groups organized clean-up campaigns, patrolling the streets at night to deter dealers. The Harlem Women's Christian Temperance League published pamphlets titled, "Save Our Sons from the Needle." Yet, even as they distributed these tracts, new shipments arrived at the docks each week, and the trade continued undisturbed. By the late 1930s, Harlem's dope economy had become self-sustaining. The city could not destroy it because, in a perverse way, the city needed it, or at least, needed it contained. The heroin trade was both symptom and safety valve. It kept Harlem quiet, manageable, predictable. For the authorities, that was enough. But within Harlem itself, the consequences deepened. Families were broken, music was lost, and a generation of young men, barely old enough to vote, learned that the only way to earn was to sell something that would destroy the people they loved. It is hard, now, to imagine the scale of silence that surrounded it all. There were no official numbers, no comprehensive studies. The records that survive are fragmented, police logs, medical reports, scattered oral histories. But they all point to the same truth. By 1940, heroin was no longer an outsider's poison. It was part of the fabric of life in Harlem. Imagine the scene at night. A man standing on a corner near 137th Street, his collar turned up against the cold. A customer approaches quietly, no words exchanged. A small envelope changes hands and both walk away. No drama, no music, just survival. You can almost hear it. The faint crackle of the city, the hum of the elevated train, the whisper of footsteps on wet pavement. Beneath it all, the same quiet question rises. How did a community that gave the world its brightest art become the marketplace for its darkest escape? And if everyone was, in some way, both victim and participant, who could ever claim innocence? The streets of Harlem by night were a strange kind of orchestra. The horns from the clubs, the murmurs from the corners, the occasional siren somewhere far off, all layered into something that sounded alive but wary. And within that wary sound were the footsteps of Harlem's users, the addicts who were never just statistics, never just headlines. They were the sons of Pullman porters, the daughters of seamstresses, the dancers, the trumpet players, the janitors, the men who'd come north in search of work and found instead a city that loved their music but ignored their hunger. By the late 1930s, heroin use in Harlem had settled into something almost routine. It wasn't shocking anymore, it was known. You could walk down Lenox Avenue and see it in the faces. Not always the desperation, but the quiet surrender. The small tremor of the hand, the long blink, the way a person's body seemed to float half a second behind their mind. For many, heroin had begun as something else entirely. A medical drug, prescribed in legitimate clinics for pain, insomnia, or depression. The Harlem Hospital archives contain cases where patients, especially musicians and dancers, were treated for nervous exhaustion with morphine-based tonics. Those tonics, once finished, left a craving that the legal system had no answer for. The word junkie hadn't yet become common. People said user fiend, sick one, or sometimes just brother. Addiction was still partly medical, partly moral, partly invisible. And because Harlem was a place where privacy was rare, where 10 people might share 2 rooms, addiction was both public and secret at once. A woman might disappear into the bathroom for too long, a musician might show up late to rehearsal, moving slow, eyes glassy. Everyone knew, but no one said much. There was too much shame for confession, too much love for condemnation. The musicians were especially vulnerable. They lived by irregular hours, constant travel, and the emotional demands of performance. Heroin, for many, offered what they called quiet time, a way to slow the pulse after nights of playing until dawn. There were rumors, whispered, never written, that some of Harlem's greatest talents used the medicine to steady their nerves. Others did it to forget. And when word spread that a certain drummer or trumpet player had gone under, the community grieved quietly, like a family ashamed to speak of illness. The angels of Lenox Avenue. In the midst of it all, a handful of women tried to save the neighborhood in ways that didn't make the newspapers. They were the mothers, the church ladies, the so-called angels of Lenox Avenue. By day they worked as laundresses or maids. By night they patrolled their blocks, stopping at stoops, calling out names in the dark. "Baby, you come on home now. Ain't nothing for you out here." They carried little flashlights and wore old coats, sometimes walking in groups of 3 or 4. They couldn't arrest anyone or offer treatment, but they could offer something else. Attention. The kind that said, "You are still seen." One of them, Miss Thelma Brooks, later told an interviewer in the 1950s, "We weren't the law, honey. We were just tired of burying our children." These women often clashed with the dope peddlers, but there was also an unspoken respect. The dealers knew the mothers were untouchable. You didn't curse at them, didn't threaten them. If they told a boy to go home, sometimes he actually did. They started small networks, informal, quiet, that eventually became the seed for Harlem's first community-led addiction programs. Years later, when the city finally began to fund rehabilitation clinics, many of those women were listed in the founding rosters, though their names rarely appeared in official reports. They represented the soul of Harlem's resistance, patient, maternal, quietly radical. The agents of order while the angels walked the streets. Another kind of patrol had begun to creep through Harlem. Men in dark suits, badges in their pockets, armed with new federal authority. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics, led by Harry Anslinger, had declared war. Harlem was to be the showcase. Anslinger, a man who believed moral panic was good policy, saw in Harlem both the perfect enemy and the perfect stage. His agents raided apartments, confiscated drugs, and photographed black addicts for propaganda posters labeled "Before and After Dope." The images were crude but effective. They fueled a national obsession, the myth that jazz, race, and narcotics were inseparable. Anslinger himself once claimed that Negro jazz musicians create the music under the influence of drugs, and the result is satanic. His words shaped law enforcement for decades. They justified everything from street harassment to mass arrests. But inside Harlem, the agents were a contradiction. Some were genuinely trying to help, men who believed that breaking the supply chain could save lives. Others were opportunists, extortionists, or worse. There are surviving affidavits that describe agents planting evidence, shaking down dealers for bribes, or even reselling confiscated drugs back into the same neighborhoods they'd just raided. The lines between enforcement and participation blurred completely. Still, the arrests piled up. Between 1935 and 1940, narcotics-related convictions in Manhattan tripled, and Harlem accounted for nearly half. The result wasn't safety, it was fear. Addicts began injecting in hidden basements, abandoned lots, rooftops. The use of shared needles skyrocketed, spreading infections. And because addiction was criminalized, medical care was avoided. The city's main detox center, located downtown, admitted only a fraction of those who sought help. It was a cycle that fed itself. Poverty created addiction. Addiction created crime. Crime justified more policing, and more policing deepened the poverty. And beneath it all, the rhythm of Harlem went on. The clubs, the parades, the sermons, the laughter that refused to die. The soundtrack of dissent. There was a strange poetry in the way heroin entered Harlem's art. You could hear it in the slow, mournful tempo of certain jazz standards, the way a saxophone line might start bright and then sink unresolved into silence. Writers, too, began to capture it. Claude McKay hinted at it in his later poems. The sense of a city in a dream, nodding between light and loss. Even Langston Hughes, careful to protect his neighborhood's dignity, wrote quietly of needles of forgetting. In these works, heroin wasn't rebellion. It was the sound of exhaustion, the longing to stop feeling, to stop remembering. The irony was painful. Harlem had once been the symbol of artistic and moral uplift, a place of cultural rebirth. Yet here it was, now depicted as America's cautionary tale. The same newspapers that had once celebrated the Harlem Renaissance now filled their pages with stories of Harlem's drug inferno. But the truth, as always, was quieter and more complex. Most of Harlem was not addicted. Most of its people were hardworking, sober, deeply moral. But when the white press needed to sell fear, it pointed uptown, and Harlem bore the burden. The unseen victories for all the tragedy, there were moments of resistance that rarely made the record books. A dentist on 135th Street, Charles Boyd, quietly began treating addicts for withdrawal using diluted morphine, a primitive version of methadone maintenance decades before its time. A group of black nurses at Harlem Hospital began to compile their own data on overdose deaths, frustrated that official reports ignored racial breakdowns, and an informal coalition of jazz club owners quietly banned known pushers from their venues, not to protect the police, but to protect their musicians. One club, the Uptown Rooster, posted a handwritten sign at its door, Music lives longer than the stuff. Don't bring poison to the party. These small acts didn't end the epidemic, but they slowed it. They gave Harlem the gift of endurance, of surviving even when help never came. A mirror in the smoke. By 1940, Harlem's heroin crisis had become both invisible and inescapable. It was part of the architecture now. The tenements, the alleys, the whispered warnings between mothers. But within that same darkness, a stubborn kind of light persisted. It's there in the photographs. The women smiling on stoops, the children playing stickball on cracked pavement, the men in pressed suits heading to church on Sunday. For every addict, there were 10 who resisted. For every pusher, there was a mother watching, a preacher praying, a nurse refusing to give up. The heroin trade had been born of neglect, but Harlem's response, wary, imperfect but unbroken, was born of love. And love in Harlem was always louder than despair. When the 1940s began, Harlem was still a place of sound, music, sermons, street calls. But something had changed in the tone. The laughter was quieter, the nights a little shorter, and the air inside the clubs felt heavier somehow. There was talk that the dope boys had gone too far, that the neighborhood was tired of hiding its wounds. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics, still led by Harry Anslinger, sensed an opportunity. The war in Europe had just broken out, and the US government was tightening its laws, eager to show strength on every front, including the domestic one. Narcotics, they said, were weakening America's moral fiber, and Harlem, as always, was the laboratory of that theory. The raids began. It started quietly, one building at a time. Federal agents began to stage coordinated operations with the New York Police Department, targeting what they called known dens. The truth was more complex. Many of those dens were simply apartments where addicts gathered for safety or to share what little they had. Still, the raids made headlines. In 1941, a massive bust on 147th Street captured 12 suspects and 2 pounds of pure heroin, enough, one paper claimed, to poison the whole of Harlem. The reality was less dramatic, but the symbolism was potent. Anslinger's men had photographers ready. They took pictures of suspects lined up against cracked brick walls, their faces half in shadow. The images appeared in national magazines under captions like, "Harlem's Dope Kings Fall." But if you looked closely, you could see most weren't kings. They were delivery boys, chauffiers, errand men. Some were barely 20. For every dealer arrested, another took his place within days. The real suppliers, the ones controlling the shipments from Europe and Latin America, remained untouched, protected by money, distance, and politics. Still, for the local press and white America, the narrative was satisfying. Harlem was being cleansed. But inside Harlem, people whispered that something sacred was being broken. Trust, privacy, community. The war and the shortage. Then came World War II, and with it a strange shift. Global trade routes were disrupted, and heroin, once smuggled in through European ports, grew scarce. The shortage hit Harlem hard. Addicts could no longer find their usual supply, and what remained was dangerously impure. Dealers began to cut the drug with chalk, quinine, even sugar. Some used powdered milk or talcum, desperate to stretch their stock. The result was a surge in overdoses and infections. At Harlem Hospital, doctors began to record strange new symptoms: abscesses, fevers, paralysis, caused not by heroin itself, but by the filth it came mixed with. Patients arrived trembling, hallucinating, pleading for help that the hospital wasn't allowed to provide. Federal law still treated addiction as a criminal matter, not a medical one. Dr. Louis Wright, one of Harlem's first black physicians, tried to argue otherwise. He told city officials that addiction was a disease of despair, a symptom of social failure, not moral weakness. His words were dismissed as sentimental. The raids continued. The arrests continued. The sickness deepened. Trials and testimonies. By 1943, Harlem had become the courtroom backdrop for one of the largest narcotics trials in New York history. 24 defendants stood accused of trafficking thousands of dollars worth of heroin. Most were small-time dealers. A few were musicians, cab drivers, or waiters supplementing their meager incomes. The trial lasted weeks. Anslinger's agents testified about undercover stings, coded conversations, and sinister networks. But much of it was theater, designed not to dismantle the trade, but to showcase the Bureau's moral crusade. Newspapers printed daily updates, often with racist undertones. One headline read "En narration UFO ODLM." Yet for all the spectacle, little changed. After the convictions, the supply routes simply shifted. The dope now came through Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Gulf Coast, carried by veterans returning from overseas or hidden in cargo shipments labeled as medical supplies. The dealers who replaced the old ones were smarter, colder, and less connected to the community. The informal code of respect that had once kept violence at bay began to erode. Where an older dealer might have refused to sell near a church or playground, the new generation cared only for money. It was the quiet end of a strange, unspoken order. The collapse of trust. The raids had another consequence, one Anslinger never predicted. They didn't just drive drugs underground, they drove people apart. Neighbors began to suspect each other. A woman who had once borrowed sugar from the next-door apartment now avoided eye contact in the hallway. Landlords refused to rent to families with sons of a certain age, and some residents, desperate to protect themselves, began acting as informants, trading names for leniency. This new climate of fear reached even into the jazz clubs. Musicians whispered that agents had planted listeners in the audience, waiting to follow them home after gigs. The Savoy Ballroom, once the heartbeat of Harlem, grew cautious about who it let through the door. The energy of the Harlem Renaissance, spontaneous, open, alive, dimmed beneath the weight of suspicion. And beneath it all, the addicts kept suffering, quieter now, more hidden, more alone. The street's new order. By 1944, Harlem's drug economy had changed entirely. The small-time peddlers, the boys with paper packets and nervous smiles, were mostly gone. In their place came organized crime, men with connections to Italian and Irish syndicates downtown, who treated Harlem as a profitable outpost rather than a home. They brought in stricter hierarchies, new codes, and ruthless discipline. The warmth, the neighborly protection, even the occasional mercy that had existed before, all vanished. The dope was cheaper, deadlier, and more plentiful than ever. Harlem's police precincts became overwhelmed. The same officers who had once taken bribes to look away now found themselves facing well-funded, well-armed gangs with roots in the broader New York underworld. And yet, to the outside world, Harlem's clean-up had succeeded. Anslinger boasted in reports that the Bureau had severed the veins of the Harlem drug machine. He received awards, promotions, and press coverage. But on the ground, Harlem knew otherwise. It had not been healed, only hollowed out. Echoes in the music through it all. Harlem's musicians kept playing. Even in the darkest years, the clubs refused to fall silent. You could still walk into Minton's Playhouse or Small's Paradise and hear the wild new sound of bebop, fast, angular, defiant. It was as if the city's pain had become rhythm. Every riff carried the memory of what had been lost and what had survived. Dizzy Gillespie once said that Harlem's sound wasn't just music, it was armor. Behind the laughter, behind the solos, there was a shared exhaustion, but also a shared pride. They were playing through the pain, playing past it. And in those notes, something like hope lingered. The end of an era. When the war ended in 1945, the soldiers came home to a country that barely recognized them, and to a Harlem that had changed beyond recognition. The neighborhood's population had thinned. Many who could afford to move south or to the Bronx did so. Those who remained inherited both the beauty and the burden of survival. The heroin epidemic didn't end. It only shifted shape, waiting for the next generation. The 1950s would bring methadone. The 1960s would bring protest. The 1970s would bring heroin's return, deadlier than before. But for those who remembered the first plague, the one that began in the jazz clubs and basements of the 1930s, there was a particular kind of silence that followed. They no longer spoke of it openly. It was too raw, too shameful, too ordinary. It became part of Harlem's collective memory, the story everyone knew but no one told. Reflections in the ruins. If you walk through Harlem today, down 135th Street, past the brownstones and the churches, you can still sense the ghosts of that time. The stoops where mothers once called out to their sons. The corners where agents stood in the rain waiting. The echoes of laughter, faint but insistent. The heroin trade of the 1930s and 40s was not just a story about drugs. It was about poverty, policy, art, and the fragile balance between survival and decay. It was about a community that, despite every betrayal, kept its humanity intact. Harlem fell, but it never stopped singing. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all, that even in the grip of despair, the city still found a rhythm to live by. A rhythm that outlasted the needles, the headlines, and the fear. The sound came first. Before the smell of oil and cloth, before the heat of the machines, before even the light of morning reached the windows, the silk mills of Macclesfield, in the northwest of England, began their day with sound. A long, droning pulse, the turn of the great wheels, the clatter of 1,000 threads being stretched and wound. It was, in its own strange way, music, mechanical, relentless, and almost alive. At 5 in the morning the girls began to arrive. Most were no more than 14, some as young as 11. They came in shawls and thick boots, hair pinned up beneath headscarves, carrying lunch wrapped in paper, a bit of bread, perhaps a slice of cold potato or dripping. The gates opened and the day began. Inside, the air shimmered with moisture. Silk, delicate as it was, needed humidity to stay supple. So the overseers kept the windows shut and the floors wet, sprinkling them with water to keep the dust down. The result was a room that felt like a low fog, warm, sticky, and filled with the steady heartbeat of machinery. If you stood at one end of the spinning room and looked down its length, it seemed endless, row after row of looms, wheels, and reels, all moving together in perfect indifference to the humans who fed them. And among them always were the girls. The lives woven in thread. The silk industry had been England's pride in the 18th century. By 1900 it was a relic, still beautiful, but no longer powerful. The cheaper cotton mills of Lancashire had overtaken it long ago. Still, towns like Macclesfield and Coventry clung to silk, partly out of tradition and partly out of pride. The fabric symbolized refinement, luxury, and the memory of empire. For the factory girls, however, silk was less a luxury than a sentence. They worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week. The official wage for a young spinner was 4 shillings a week. Not enough to live on, even in a crowded lodging house. Most gave their wages directly to their mothers, who used it to keep food on the table for the whole family. The youngest girls, called piecers, had one of the hardest jobs. Their task was to mend broken threads while the looms kept running, which meant darting between spinning wheels that could easily catch a sleeve, a finger, or a braid of hair. In 1903, the Macclesfield Chronicle published a small notice, barely 3 lines long, describing how a girl of 12 had lost her hand to a reel. The factory paid her a week's wages in compensation. Her name was never recorded. It was not uncommon. It was not considered scandalous. It was simply the cost of silk. The overseers and the silent supervision in the mills was strict, though rarely loud. The overseers, mostly men, carried notebooks and whistles. They walked between the rows, checking the quality of the thread, the tension of the machines, the speed of the workers. But in the silk mills, discipline was subtle. Unlike the shouting found in cotton factories, here silence was part of the culture. The girls learned to communicate with glances, small gestures, or a raised brow. Talking was forbidden during work hours. The noise of the machines was considered punishment enough. There was 1 hour for dinner at midday. The girls would gather outside, on stone steps or against the mill wall, where the air was at least moving. They would unwrap their food and talk quietly. About brothers in the mines, about the price of soap, about the possibility of moving to Manchester one day, or to London if they were lucky. Then the bell would ring again, and the silence resumed. A factory without faces. The deeper you look into the archives of Edwardian factory life, the more anonymous it becomes. Factory records list wages and output, but not names. Even the census, when it lists silk worker or reeler, gives no clue to the personality behind the title. But sometimes fragments survive. One comes from the diary of Martha Henschel, a silk winder from Cheshire who wrote a few lines in 1908. The new girl in my row fainted again today. It is the heat, I think. The foreman said we must not stop the reel, so we worked around her. When she woke, she said she dreamed she was outside in the rain. A simple note. And yet in it lies the whole truth of industrial life, that the human body was an inconvenience to production, something to be endured rather than cared for. Martha's diary continues elsewhere. Sometimes I think of what we make. Ribbons for dresses, thread for fine scarves. It is strange to make beauty while one feels so plain. The hidden rooms, not all the girls returned home after the factory bell. Some stayed behind for extra hours, cleaning the machines or helping the older women with sorting and winding. Others went upstairs, to the attic rooms where silk samples were checked by candlelight. It was in those upper rooms, away from the main floor, that the lines of class became visible. Here worked the inspectors, mostly men, who examined the finished spools, measured color consistency, and tested for strength. The girls who assisted them often earned a little more, an extra shilling a week, but they were also more vulnerable. Rumors spread easily in the mill world about the inspector who lingered too long beside a girl at her station, about the foreman who promised a better shift in exchange for silence. There were no formal complaints, no police, no recourse. Just silence, the same silence that ruled the machines. To the outside world, these were respectable places employing respectable women. But within those walls, respectability was a fragile illusion built on the exhaustion of the poor and the obedience of the young. Sunday dresses and small joys, and yet, life was not only hardship. Sunday was a world apart. The same girls who moved like ghosts through the factory during the week transformed on the Sabbath. They wore white blouses, pinned ribbons in their hair, and walked through the parks arm in arm, laughing too loudly for the liking of older townsfolk. Many belonged to temperance choirs, women's reading circles, or charity sewing guilds. Quiet forms of community that gave meaning to the hours beyond the mill. There were outings to the seaside in the summer, short, crowded train rides to Blackpool or Southport, where for one day they could take off their boots and wade into the cold water, shrieking with delight. The photographs from these trips show rows of smiling girls, dresses rolled up to the knee, eyes squinting in the light. If you didn't know their lives, you might mistake them for the daughters of comfort, but look closely and you'll notice the hands, the calluses, the missing fingernails, the faint burn marks from the oil lamps, signs of labor that no ribbon or smile could fully conceal. The slow machine of reform. By the early 1910s, public attitudes were beginning to shift. The Factory Acts, long debated and slowly amended, finally began to restrict the hours of child labor and to mandate basic safety measures. Inspectors, real inspectors, this time, were sent to the mills. But enforcement was thin and corruption common. Some mill owners simply paid the fine and continued as before. Others moved production to smaller workshops where the law could not easily reach. Still, small changes appeared. The youngest children were moved to part-time schooling. The workday was shortened by an hour, and wages, very slowly, began to rise. For the girls who had already spent a decade at the looms, it was too late. Their bodies were worn out before their 20s. Many suffered from lung conditions caused by breathing in silk dust, others from chronic joint pain. But the next generation, their younger sisters, would inherit something better, even if only slightly. And that in its quiet way was progress. Threads of the future. Looking back now, it's tempting to imagine the silk mills as dark places of endless suffering. And in some ways, they were. But they were also places where women built their first networks of solidarity, where friendship, endurance, and quiet rebellion began to take shape. Many of those factory girls would go on to join early trade unions, women's suffrage groups, and cooperative movements. Some would later march in the streets of Manchester and London, demanding the vote. Others would become nurses during the First World War or clerks in the new offices that replaced the old mills. They were not the heroines of grand revolutions. They were the unnoticed foundation, the quiet working backbone of a changing country. Their history survives not in monuments, but in the faint smell of oil that still clings to old silk, and in the silence of photographs where no one thought to record their names. The looms turn, the years pass, and the thread continues, spinning from silence into something stronger. But who were these women beyond the machines? What did they believe, love, and fear, and what small acts of resistance hid beneath their quiet obedience? That's where the story turns next. The mill at night was a different world. The great looms slept, their belts hanging slack and motionless. The air was cooler, and the smell of oil seemed softer somehow, less choking, almost gentle. But the silence never lasted long. When the day's shift ended and the girls went home, a smaller crew remained. They called it the cleaning hour, though it often stretched well into 2 or 3. The older women, who could be trusted with the keys, stayed to wipe the wheels, scrub the floors, and untangle the threads that had snarled during the day. It was during those quiet hours that whispers traveled most freely. The things no one dared say beneath the overseer's eyes. The whisper chain. In every factory, there was an invisible network of voices. A chain of small, careful confidences that moved from row to row like an underground river. No one ever spoke too loudly. Words were passed in fragments. Did you hear? They say the inspector's cousin's been sacked. Mary's brothers joined the men's union. And sometimes, something softer. Annie's ill again. She can't afford the doctor. Pass the hat. There was no union for the women yet. No formal meetings. But there was solidarity, fierce and quiet. When one girl fell sick, others would cover her shifts, taking on extra hours without pay. When a family couldn't manage rent, someone would bring bread or coal. They called it looking out for one another, never realizing that what they were doing had another name: collective power. The secrets of the back room. Behind the spinning hall, there was a small chamber the girls called the back room, a narrow space lined with wooden shelves used to store thread spools. By day it was a storeroom. By night it became something else. On Fridays, when the foreman left early, a few of the girls would gather there after hours. They'd bring what they could: a candle stub, a crust of bread, a bit of cheap tea. And once the door was closed, the mill transformed. Someone might begin humming a hymn, "Abide with Me," or "The Old Rugged Cross." Another would tell a story about her hometown. Sometimes they read aloud from The Woman Worker, a small socialist pamphlet passed around in secret, its pages smudged with oil and fingerprints. Most couldn't read, but one or two could. Often the older ones who'd gone to Sunday school before they were sent to the mill. They would read slowly, carefully, sounding out each word. "It says here," one girl whispered, "that a woman's work is worth no less than a man's." "Well, tell that to the masters," another said, and the room filled with soft laughter, the kind that feels dangerous and delicious all at once. The Song of the Looms songs were another kind of rebellion. You couldn't shout in the factory, but you could hum, and the hum could spread. The rhythm of the machines lent itself to melody. Each loom made a pattern: clack, hiss, thrum, and the girls learned to work in time with it, adding little tunes that slipped between the beats. It began as nonsense, half-remembered lullabies or hymns sung under breath. But over time, the songs changed. Someone would alter a line to mock the overseer. Another would slip in a joke about wages or food. Before long, they had mill songs, simple, funny, and fierce in their own small way. "Oh, the reel spins fine and the reel spins fast, but my pennies won't last till Sunday past. The silk runs smooth, the master's glad, but the girls go home in rags and sad." These verses never appeared in print. They lived only in memory, passed from voice to voice until they became part of the air itself. The letter that shouldn't have been written. In the spring of 1909, a girl named Eliza Trent, 17, tall, with restless eyes, did something few dared. She wrote a letter. It was addressed to the local paper, the Cheshire Observer, signed only "A Factory Girl." In it, she described the heat, the wages, and the injuries no one spoke of. She ended with a single, simple plea: "We do not ask for charity, only that our work be seen." The letter was printed, tucked away on page 5 between notices for horse sales and church bazaars. For a few weeks it caused a stir. A factory inspector was sent to inquire. The owner dismissed the letter as exaggeration. The overseers warned the girls against gossip. But among the workers, Eliza became something more than a name. She became a kind of legend. No one ever proved it was her. But the other girls knew, and from then on they called her the Brave One. Years later, when the unions formed, some of the women who joined the first meetings would remember that letter. That small spark that had dared to burn, if only for a moment. Sisterhood and the small revolt's rebellion didn't always come in banners or speeches. Sometimes it came in sewing needles and stolen minutes. When a girl was punished, given extra hours, or a smaller wage for answering back, her friends would quietly help. They'd swap places in the work line, pretending mistakes to slow production, or they'd hide a broken spool so the overseer couldn't dock her pay. These were small acts of sabotage, almost invisible, but they mattered. They gave the girls a sense that they still had choices, that even inside the iron rhythm of the machines, they were not entirely powerless. And perhaps more radical than anything was kindness itself, the insistence on caring in a system built on indifference. The night of the rain one evening, the rain came hard, pounding against the mill roof, seeping through cracks, turning the floors slick. The overseers had gone home, leaving the night crew to finish cleaning. When a loose tile gave way, water poured in over one of the looms, soaking the spools. The women panicked. Wet silk meant ruined thread, and ruined thread meant lost wages. Without orders, they moved together. Buckets, cloths, rags, working as one, laughing as they splashed barefoot in the puddles. Someone began to sing, and others joined in, voices echoing through the cavernous hall. It was a sound no overseer would ever allow joy inside the mill. The next morning, the foreman scolded them for disorderly conduct. But the silk was saved, and though no one said it aloud, the women walked home that day a little taller. Because they had proven, for one soaked and shining night, that they didn't need permission to act together. The war comes in 1914, the mills changed forever. The men went to fight, and suddenly, women were needed, not just as spinners, but as managers, inspectors, and bookkeepers. Eliza's old letter resurfaced in the local paper, this time reprinted as "The Voice of Our Working Women." No one knew who had written it, but its message now sounded prophetic. The girls who once whispered in the back room found themselves training new workers, managing production for uniforms and bandages. They were still underpaid, But for the first time, they were visible. And when the war ended, they did not return quietly to their old places. Many joined the new Women's Textile Union, demanding fair wages and better hours. The whispers had become speeches. The secret kindness had become organization. The thread had found its strength. Echoes of the loom today. If you visit Macclesfield, some of those old mills still stand. Their windows bricked over, their looms long gone. In one, there's a small museum. Beneath the glass, you'll find a silk ribbon labeled C. 1907. Factory girls are no name, no story. Just a thread, pale gold and frayed at the edges. But if you listen, really listen, you can almost hear it. The hum of the looms, the laughter behind closed doors, the secret songs woven into every inch of silk. A history not shouted, but whispered, and no less powerful for its quiet. The last shift began like any other. A whistle at 6, boots on cobblestones, the smell of oil and damp air. The girls filed in, heads bowed, the sound of the morning rain dripping from their shawls. But something in the rhythm had changed. It was 1932 now, and the silk trade, once the pride of towns like Macclesfield, was dying. Across England, mills were closing one by one. Synthetic fibres were taking hold. Rayon, or artificial silk, they called it, was cheaper, brighter, and easier to weave. Orders from London slowed to a trickle. Some mills turned to producing parachute fabric or medical gauze. Others simply stopped. For the women who had grown up in the noise of looms, the silence that followed was unbearable. The empty halls when a mill closed, it didn't happen all at once. It died by degrees. First came the rumours, whispered between shifts. Then came the layoffs. Temporary suspensions, they were called. Weeks without work, then months. The lucky few were kept on for essential operations. They cleaned the machines, packed away spools, and oiled gears that would never turn again. Eliza Trent, now in her 40s, was one of them. Her hair, once bright, was streaked with grey. Her hands bore scars from 30 years of spinning. Every morning she came in, lit the lamps, and wiped the dust from the looms. Not because she was told to, but because it felt wrong to let them die untended. The mill had been her second home, her livelihood, her prison, her pride. Now it was just an echoing shell. The machinery sleeps, there's a strange intimacy to abandoned industry. When the workers leave, the machines remain, like fossils of effort, still stained with the fingerprints of those who touched them. The belts stiffen. The air grows still. Threads that once sang now sag and gather dust. Eliza sometimes caught herself talking to them. The reels, the bobbins, the old steam engine that had once shaken the floor. "You've done your bit," she'd whisper. "You can rest now." It was foolish, maybe, but not uncommon. Across the north, hundreds of women said their goodbyes the same way. Not to foremen or owners, but to the tools that had shaped their days. For all the hardship, the mill had given them identity. It had made them part of something vast, something that moved and breathed. And as the age of silk slipped away, they grieved it like the passing of a friend. Memory in the dust. As the years went on, the buildings fell silent. The windows broke. The children who'd once waited for their mothers at the gate grew up and left for the cities. For London, for Manchester, for anywhere that offered more than thread. Some mills were converted to warehouses. Others were simply left to rot. Yet every so often, someone would wander back in, to look, to remember. One of those was Margaret Trent, Eliza's daughter. In 1950, she returned to the site of the old mill, now derelict, with ivy crawling over the doors. Inside, she found her mother's workbench still intact. On it lay a small wooden spool, one that had never been used. Margaret took it home and placed it on her mantel. She told her children it was a piece of the past. But sometimes, late at night, she'd pick it up and feel the grooves in the wood, the indentations worn by her mother's hands. It wasn't just an object. It was proof. Proof that women like Eliza had existed, had laboured, had mattered. The men who forgot, in the official histories written at mid-century, the mills barely appeared. Economists wrote of shifts in global production, changes in raw material, technological adaptation. They wrote about profit margins, exports, imports. Everything except the people who had turned the wheels. The women who'd worked the looms became a footnote. Female labour in secondary sectors. Their songs were not recorded. Their laughter, their injuries, their whispered prayers, all gone. But not completely. Archivists in the 1970s began to notice something odd in old council records, letters, petitions, fragments of textile ledgers signed in faint pencil by Brooks, Wilton, E. Trent. Tiny traces left behind like threads caught on a nail. One historian called them the ghosts in the paperwork. And in those ghosts the story began to breathe again. A future woven from the past. In the late 1980s, a group of women in Macclesfield, retired teachers, daughters of mill workers, formed the Silk Heritage Trust. Their goal was simple: to save what was left. They gathered tools, cloth samples, and oral histories. They recorded the memories of anyone still alive who'd worked the mills. Some of the recordings still survive, crackling voices describing the rhythm of the looms, the burns from the oil lamps, the taste of dust in the air. One old woman, her accent thick and musical, said this: "It was hard work, but it was ours. We made something fine, something beautiful." That phrase became the inscription above the museum's entrance: "We made something fine." It's a small sentence, quiet, almost humble, but it holds a world inside it. Threads in the modern light today, the silk that once clothed queens and bishops lies folded behind glass. Visitors walk through the museum, reading placards, marveling at the machinery. They point at the looms, at the bobbins, at the hand-woven ribbons. But what they can't see is the rhythm, the pulse that once filled these halls, the heartbeat of thousands of women whose names never appeared in ledgers or headlines. Yet, in a way, they're still there. In every sound the building makes, the groan of the old beams, the whisper of wind through cracked windows, you can almost hear them, not haunting exactly, just lingering, like the aftertaste of song. The last ribbon on a quiet day in 1997, a curator unrolled a strip of pale blue silk discovered in a chest from the old warehouse district. Along its edge, faintly embroidered in uneven letters, were the words, "To the girls who made the light shine." No record explains who stitched it or when, but historians suspect it was made in the 1930s, perhaps by the last generation of mill girls, as the industry faded. A farewell gift, maybe, a message left not for the owners but for each other, because even when the work was gone the bond remained. And so, the thread did not break, it simply changed form, from fabric to memory, from noise to silence, from labor to legend. When you close your eyes tonight, imagine it: the looms at rest, the dust drifting through morning light, the air thick with echoes of laughter and machine song. It's boring history, yes, measured in threads and hours and wages, but inside that boredom lies something eternal. The quiet triumph of ordinary lives, woven one shift at a time. London after the Great War was a city both alive and haunted. Every street seemed to breathe and ache at once. New music, new machines, new grief. The soldiers had come home, but not all of them came back whole. Those who survived carried the war inside their bodies, their dreams, their drinks. And in that strange half, light between mourning and forgetting, nightlife was born again. The cafes of Soho, the hotel lounges of Piccadilly, and the basements beneath Mayfair filled with sound. Pianos, clarinets, laughter that went on until dawn. It was as if London were determined to dance its way out of sorrow. But behind the glamour of the bright young things and the glittering debutantes, another world worked the night. One quieter, poorer, and infinitely more human. The world of the midnight hostesses. The women behind the lights. To the newspapers, they were simply hostesses, a vague, polite word that covered a multitude of sins and situations. Some poured drinks. Some danced with lonely businessmen. Some sold cigarettes, others sold company. They were not courtesans in the old sense, nor quite servants, nor free in any respectable way. They were part of a new economy of charm. Women who could laugh easily, listen well, and keep a room alive until closing time. For a few shillings an hour, they kept the illusion of celebration alive. Many had once been factory workers, mill girls, or shop assistants. When industry slowed in the late 1920s, and when marriage was no longer a guarantee of survival, the clubs offered something else: warmth, food, and cash paid in hand. Their uniforms varied. Silk gowns borrowed from the wardrobe mistress, second-hand fur wraps, costume jewelry bright as real diamonds under gaslight. But what mattered most wasn't the dress. It was the performance. You had to make the men feel seen. You had to make the music feel real. And you had to make it all seem effortless. The birth of the clubs, London's pleasure clubs, began quietly, in the ruins of Prohibition's shadow. While America had outlawed alcohol, England merely restricted it. And what is forbidden elsewhere always finds a market somewhere else. Soho's Greek Street, Dean Street, and Frith Street became a maze of half-legal cellars and drawing rooms converted into private members' clubs. There were dozens by 1925: the Silver Slipper, the Blue Angel, the Paradise Cellar, Mimi's Midnight Room. They operated under polite fictions. Officially, they were dining societies or music rooms. But everyone knew, you went there to forget the daylight. Some were elegant, attended by journalists, artists, and visiting Americans with pocketfuls of dollars. Others were rougher, smoky, cramped, where gin was poured from teapots and the floor was sticky by midnight. The police knew too, of course. But bribes changed hands, and as long as no scandal reached the morning papers, the show went on. A night at the Blue Angel, imagine it's 1931, and you've just stepped down the narrow stairs into the Blue Angel Club, hidden behind an unmarked door off Shaftesbury Avenue. The room is small, maybe 30 feet wide, low ceiling, blue velvet curtains. The band is playing something lazy like Ain't Misbehavin'. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and the faint sweetness of cheap perfume. At the tables sit soldiers in uniform, colonial officials, actors, secretaries, girls with short hair and nervous smiles. A hostess named Vera May moves between them, smiling. She's 24, pale, with dark lipstick and a laugh trained to sound spontaneous. Her job is to keep conversation flowing, to make sure no one looks too lonely and no glass stays empty. She isn't rich, but she's proud. Her wages, 12 shillings a night, plus tips, support her mother and younger brother in a small flat near Paddington. Her life is lived between midnights, waking at noon, reading the Daily Mirror over tea, painting her nails while the city hums outside. By 8 she's powdered, dressed, and back under the lights again. Some nights are good. A kind patron, a generous tip, a few dances, laughter that feels almost sincere. Other nights men are drunk and cruel. You learn to deflect with grace. Vera keeps a small notebook in her handbag, where she writes phrases she overhears. You don't know boredom till you've been rich. All the good men died in France. Power me something that forgets. She writes them down not because she means to publish them, but because they feel like truth. The city of masks. By the early 1930s, London had perfected the art of pretending. The Depression hit hard. Factories closed. Unemployment rose. Yet in the West End, the illusion of glamour only grew stronger. Photographs of the time show obsessed with surfaces, shining cars, sleek bobbed hair, sequin dresses. Beneath it all, the fear of collapse, social, moral, economic, lingered like a faint smell of smoke. The hostesses, in their way, were mirrors of that illusion. They smiled through debt, loneliness, and exhaustion. They gave the illusion of abundance in an age of scarcity. And for a few hours each night, they became the rhythm of the city, keeping its heart beating with chatter and charm. Many of them were immigrants, too, Irish, French, Polish, West Indian. London drew them in with promises of modernity. The club scene was one of the few places where an accent or a different skin tone wasn't immediately a barrier. Music softened everything. Jazz, especially, turned strangers into co-conspirators. It was, as one writer later said, a democracy of dim light, policing pleasure, but the city's tolerance was fragile. In 1927, the Licensing Act tightened control over private clubs. The Metropolitan Police formed the Public Morals Branch, tasked with investigating improper entertainment. Raids became common. Officers burst in mid-song, lights blazing, notebooks out. In their reports, they wrote phrases like, "A number of women, calling themselves hostesses, were found mingling freely with men of unknown background." And no law was broken, not exactly, but morality was the weapon. Sometimes the hostesses were arrested, though charges rarely stuck. More often, the clubs paid fines, closed briefly, and reopened under new names. Each raid, though, left scars. For the women it meant humiliation. Newspapers loved the stories. "Vice Den in Soho!" and printed the names when they could. For a working woman, that was a sentence. So they learned to disappear, to change names, dye hair, move on. The hostesses became ghosts, slipping between clubs and aliases, surviving by wit and silence. Between love and labor, to survive the night, you had to understand its rules. You could flirt, but not attach. Laugh, but never reveal. You could dance, but never linger too long with one man, unless he paid for a bottle. Most nights, Vera reminded herself, "I am working," but sometimes the boundary blurred. One winter evening, a patron brought her a small gift. A silver cigarette case engraved with her initials. "Just because," he said. She thanked him, smiled, and accepted. 2 weeks later, he was gone, posted to Singapore with the Colonial Office. It was always like that. Every tenderness was temporary. In her notebook, she wrote, "We are all for hire, even the men, though they don't admit it." A city between worlds. As the 1930s deepened, so did the shadows. Across Europe, fascism was rising. Refugees began arriving in London, bringing new languages, new fears. The music changed, slower, darker, more wistful. But the clubs kept glowing. They became refuges from the headlines. Places where you could still pretend the world was made of laughter and smoke. The hostesses became keepers of illusion. Their faces were the last thing people saw before dawn. before the grey streets reclaimed them. And in that liminal hour, between the clink of glasses and the closing of the blinds, history itself seemed to pause. The story of the midnight hostesses isn't glamorous, not really. It's about labor disguised as leisure, about women selling not their bodies, but their presence, their patience, their performance. They were the quiet workers of pleasure, and like the mill girls before them, their names have mostly been forgotten. But the rhythm of their lives still echoes in the night streets of Soho, if you listen closely enough. By 1932, the Blue Angel and its sister clubs had learned to live under watch. There was a rhythm to it, like tides or shifts of the moon. A few good weeks of quiet, then whispers of an impending raid, a night of panic, a few arrests, and then the calm return of music. For the women who worked the nights, it became almost a ritual: lipstick, laughter, then fear. The routine of midnight, a hostess's day, began when the rest of London's ended. At noon, the first kettle hissed in a rented room, maybe in Paddington, Camden, or Bayswater. The wallpaper was old, the light pale and watery. Tea, bread, and a cigarette were breakfast. Then came the preparations: pressing dresses, mending straps, sewing sequins back onto fraying gowns. Some girls painted their nails with boot polish because polish itself was too dear. Rouge was shared, perfumes borrowed. At 5, the city outside grew louder. Factory horns, buses, chatter. But for them, that noise meant it was time to rest. Curtains drawn, stockings off, they dozed in the half-dark. By 8, the ritual began anew: washing, powdering, setting hair. By 9, the streets called. Taxis were too costly, so most walked. Heels clicking through drizzle, past shop fronts closing for the night. They were invisible to most passers-by, though men sometimes turned to stare. By 10, they were under the lights again. Inside the clubs, inside, the illusion began. Music from a gramophone or a small band, saxophone, drums and piano. A manager at the bar, counting drinks and scanning the room. Each hostess had her station, a small cluster of tables or a patch of floor where she worked. The trick, as one woman later recalled, was to make the night feel like a promise you never had to keep. You sold company, not yourself. You made men laugh, listen, and spend. You laughed at bad jokes, remembered names, and kept the rhythm alive. Some girls paired off with regulars, men who came twice a week, who brought flowers or trinkets. Others moved constantly, never staying long enough to be claimed. And when the night ended, when the lights brightened and the last glasses were cleared, there was always that strange stillness, like waking from a dream. You walked home alone through grey streets, the hem of your dress damp, your feet aching, the first milk carts rattling past. The raids begin in the autumn of 1932. The Metropolitan Police's Public Morals Branch began its most active campaign against suspect establishments. Their language was cold, almost bureaucratic, but between the lines was a moral crusade. Officers wrote that London's nightlife had become a magnet for the idle and the indecent. So the raids multiplied. They came unannounced, sometimes just after midnight, sometimes at 2. Doors burst open, lights flared, and the band fell silent. Uniformed men took notes while plainclothes inspectors questioned patrons. Hostesses were lined up against the wall, asked for names and addresses. If they were found to be underage, or foreign, or unable to prove respectable employment, they were taken in for questioning. The price of respectability, in interwar Britain, was a currency more powerful than cash. You could lose it overnight, and once lost, it was nearly impossible to earn back. For a hostess, being named in a newspaper meant ruin. Some papers published lists after big raids, calling them revelers or women of doubtful character. One report from the Daily Express, 1933, described a scene of moral collapse in a Soho basement, where painted women laughed as police entered. In truth, many of those painted women were terrified. Some begged the reporters not to print their names. They had families in the north, or children in boarding schools who thought their mothers were dressmakers or hotel maids. The shame was enough to end employment, housing, even marriage prospects. So the women learned to live invisibly. They changed their surnames every few months. They moved rooms without notice. They told landlords they were theatre girls or chorus members. The city, in its hypocrisy, allowed them to exist, but only so long as they stayed silent. The union that never was. There were whispers in 1934 of forming a hostesses' guild, something like a union. The idea began with a woman named Maggie Dorset, a former barmaid turned club hostess who had seen too many girls dismissed without pay. She told friends at the Silver Slipper that the girls needed a voice, even if it's a quiet one. But London wasn't ready for that kind of rebellion. Managers discouraged any talk of organization. A few sympathetic journalists wrote about it in passing, calling the hostesses the most exploited class in nightlife. Nothing came of it, not formally, but in the quiet corners of dressing rooms and tea shops, women began to share advice: which clubs paid fairly, which managers were cruel, which policemen took bribes. A kind of unwritten sisterhood was born, fragile, informal, but real. They looked after one another. When a girl fell ill, others took her shifts. When someone vanished, arrested or run out of town, the others pooled money for rent or train fare. They couldn't form a union, but they built a safety net out of friendship and survival. Letters never sent. Among the things left behind by these women are fragments, postcards, diary scraps, letters never sent. One found years later in a shoebox read, "Dear Mother, I am well and earning. Please don't worry. London is full of light and sound. You would laugh to see the dresses. I work at a place called the Paradise Club. It's not what you think. I pour drinks and talk to men. It's all very proper. I dream sometimes of home, of the fields. But the nights here are strange and beautiful. I think you would understand if you saw it once. It's unsigned. No one knows who wrote it, but it feels like the voice of thousands. Women who chose not to be trapped by the narrow path society left them, even if the path they found was dangerous. Moments of quiet defiance for all the hardship. There were also moments of rebellion, small, private, but defiant. When the police raided, the girls sometimes hid bottles or whispered warnings. Once, during a 1935 raid on the Golden Fawn, the band refused to stop playing. They played "I'll See You in My Dreams" until the lights went out. Some hostesses made jokes of the system. One was reported to have told an inspector, "If talking to men is a crime, you'd best arrest half of London." Others protested silently, refusing to name fellow workers, refusing to testify, simply moving on and reopening somewhere else the next week. Their rebellion wasn't shouted. It was lived. In every night survived, every rent paid, every dawn walked home with dignity intact. A new kind of woman's society didn't know what to make of them. The newspapers alternated between moral panic and fascination. They called them night butterflies, modern Aphrodites, the city's hidden flowers. But to many younger women watching from afar, from typing pools, shops, and factories, the hostesses seemed daring, even free. They lived by their own hours, made their own money, dressed beautifully, and answered to no husband or foreman. In a quiet way, they embodied a new kind of independence, flawed, precarious, but real. They were part of a larger transformation, the 1930s working woman who smoked, danced, voted, and lived alone in a rented room. And though society sneered, it also imitated. By 1936, even respectable fashion magazines were publishing hostess gowns, satin evening dresses meant for informal entertaining. The line between condemnation and fascination blurred entirely. End of the first act. By 1936, the rhythm of London's nightlife was changing. New regulations demanded stricter licensing. Some clubs closed, others moved underground. Jazz was giving way to swing. And outside the clubs, history was stirring again. Newspapers carried stories from Europe, of marches, uniforms, speeches, war on the horizon. But inside, for now, the lights still burned. The hostesses still laughed. The music still played. As one of them later wrote in her diary, "We danced through history's last calm evening, though we did not yet know it. The Blue Angels' final summer began without anyone realizing it would be the last." The year was 1937, and London was alive in that fragile, flickering way a city can be when it feels change coming but refuses to name it. The nightclubs were still full. Music, laughter, the hum of cigarette smoke. Yet beneath the rhythm, something was shifting. The air was heavier, the laughter shorter. The gramophone still played, but the melodies had begun to sound wistful. The year of the whisper. By spring, the talk in the cloakrooms had changed. No one spoke of new dresses or customers anymore. They spoke of Germany. News drifted in from the continent like smog, Anschluss, refugees, speeches in strange, sharp tones broadcast over the wireless. The hostesses didn't discuss politics, not openly, but they felt it. Foreign gentlemen who once filled the dance floors began to vanish. Some sent hurried goodbyes, others simply stopped coming. The Blue Angels' pianist, a young man named Leon, left suddenly one June evening. His farewell was a single note pinned to the piano lead. They say musicians don't need passports, but that isn't true anymore. No one replaced him. The gramophone took over. It was cheaper, simpler, and less likely to leave. New faces, new rules. As fear crept into the headlines, London tried to look untroubled. The city painted its nails and smiled. For the hostesses, it was business as usual, or at least the pretense of it. But the atmosphere had changed. Police patrols grew more frequent. Licenses were renewed reluctantly. Inspectors began asking for proof of moral suitability. A few clubs closed quietly without notice. Others were forced to change names, decor, or ownership to escape scrutiny. One, the Silver Slipper, reinvented itself as a coffee and dance establishment. Another became a dinner society that served only lemonade. It fooled no one, but the illusion was all that mattered. Those who stayed in the trade learned to adapt, as they always had. Some turned to private parties and dance instruction, sessions in hotel suites. Others joined theatre troupes or took war factory jobs when the time came. But for a while longer, the lights of Soho still shimmered defiant, fragile, and unreal. The evacuation of night when war was finally declared in September 1939. The sound that followed wasn't the siren, it was silence. The blackout began that night. Street lamps dimmed, windows were shuttered, and the darkness swallowed London whole. To a city that had lived by light, it was disorienting, terrifying even. For the hostesses, it was the end of an era. Most clubs closed within days. The Blue Angel held out a week longer, just long enough for one last night of music. The manager, Mr. Farrow, gathered his staff and said quietly, "Leddies, the party's over. They'll need this building for soldiers soon." No one argued. They dressed in their finest for that final evening. Sequins, perfume, rouge, a defiant glow against the encroaching dark. When midnight came, they danced to "These Foolish Things." The band, hastily assembled from whoever remained, played until the generator coughed and died. Then they drank what was left of the champagne, blew out the candles, and walked home together under the blackout sky. The dispersal after the closing, the women scattered. Some took jobs as waitresses in canteens or typists for government offices. A few, surprisingly, joined the auxiliary services, the WAF, the ATS, the ARP-1. Kitty Rowland, trained as a night ambulance driver. In a letter to a friend, she wrote, "Funny, isn't it? Still working nights, still wearing uniform. Only the music's gone." Another, Dolly Vane, stayed in Soho and opened a tea stall for factory workers. She named it the Morning Star. A few left London altogether, evacuated along with children and office staff. For them, the countryside was more foreign than any nightclub had ever been. The nights grew quiet. The streets that had once pulsed with saxophone and laughter now echoed only with distant sirens. And somewhere among those sirens, the memory of the old clubs dissolved, slowly, softly, like a melody fading into air. A lost generation of night workers. Historians rarely wrote about them. When they did, it was with pity or disdain or simply curiosity. Official wartime archives list them as redundant entertainers. But that phrase misses everything: the skill, the grace, the resilience it took to survive those uncertain years. A hostess could read a room faster than most officers could read a map. She could charm, negotiate, disarm, and navigate danger with practiced ease. In a sense, they were survivalists of society. They had spent years balancing on the edge of respectability, learning how to live in a world that barely permitted them to exist. When the war came, those instincts, that adaptability, saved them. They found new work, they endured, they lived through bombings and shortages and loneliness, and they did so quietly, without complaint. The glamour was gone, but the strength remained. Traces in the rubble after the Blitz. Many of the old club buildings were gone, reduced to bricks, dust, and memory. The Blue Angels site on Dean Street was hit directly in 1941. The rubble was cleared by civil defense volunteers. Among the debris, someone found a half-melted compact mirror and a silver shoe buckle. For years afterward, passers-by said that when the wind blew down that street just right, they could hear faint music, a ghostly saxophone rising above the hum of traffic. No one believed it, of course. But stories like that have their own kind of truth. They mean something once lived there, something worth remembering. After the war, when the war ended, London danced again, but it was a different kind of dance. The new clubs were brighter, brusher, commercial. The jazz was American now, the drinks stronger, the prices higher. The old hostesses, the ones from the Blue Angel years, rarely returned. Some had married, others had aged out of the trade. Some were simply gone, vanished into the folds of the city. But once in a while, one would come back, standing at the edge of a new club, watching the neon signs flicker to life. They'd smile faintly, not with envy, but recognition. They had been there when it began, when the music had been softer, the light dimmer, the city younger, and that was enough. What remains there is little left of that world now. A few photographs, a handful of police reports, some faded postcards showing women laughing under chandeliers. But beneath those scraps lies something enduring, the quiet rebellion of survival. They were never saints, nor were they villains. They were workers, negotiating beauty, danger, and exhaustion in equal measure. Their story is not of glamour, but of persistence. And perhaps that's why it matters. Because behind every age of spectacle lies another of survival. And it is in that survival, quiet and unseen, that history breathes its deepest truths. The last light, imagine it now. London, 1939. The last club closed, the last lamps extinguished. In that darkness, a woman stands in a sequin dress, looking out a window as the sirens begin to wail. She takes off her earrings, places them in a small tin, and closes it with care. Then she turns away, steps into the dark, and disappears, not defeated, but transformed. The music has ended, but her rhythm continues, in factory halls, in hospitals, in memory. Because even when the night closes, those who lived by it never truly fade. And so the curtain falls on London's midnight hostesses. Their laughter swallowed by the war, their perfume replaced by cordite and rain. But if you listen closely, you can still hear them. In the rustle of silk, in the faint hum of an old record, in the sound of heels on wet pavement just before dawn. A world gone, but not forgotten, a light dimmed, but not extinguished. The first thing you noticed was the smell, not gunpowder, not smoke, but paper. Paper and ink and damp wool coats, the scent of Britain's quietest war. This was the world of the Ministry of Food, founded in September 1939 to control every meal, every crumb, every cup of tea that entered a citizen's life. It was, by design, the dullest corner of the war effort. And yet, without it, Britain would have starved. The building that never slept, the ministry's main offices were housed in a drab, grey structure on Kingsway, once an insurance building, now a labyrinth of typewriters and forms. At dawn, clerks arrived in coats buttoned to their throats, clutching sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. They queued for tea in enamel mugs, smoked before the morning bell, and then descended into a day of figures, ledgers, and memos. The work was endless, repetitive, essential. Each department had its own rhythm. The meat division calculated weekly imports of beef and mutton. The sugar board tracked tonnage from Caribbean colonies. The paper control office rationed envelopes, labels, and even the very forms used to issue rations. By 1940, the ministry employed nearly 20,000 civil servants, most of them women, many working outside the home for the first time. They were not soldiers, but their discipline was military. They served the front lines of hunger, a nation on a ledger. When the first ration books were printed, the presses ran day and night. The books themselves were small, grey-green, faintly rough to the touch, filled with coupons that looked harmless enough. But those pages would soon dictate the rhythm of every kitchen in Britain. Butter, sugar, bacon, tea, meat, all reduced to numbers and stamps, each person's appetite now a matter of record. The clerks called it feeding the nation by arithmetic. They filed, stamped, and signed in silence. By mid-morning, the corridors echoed with the steady percussion of typing and the shuffle of carbon paper. Sometimes the forms blurred together, columns of digits that no longer looked like food, only abstraction. But behind each figure lay a family, a dinner table, a child's empty plate. Women of the desk, the ministry's workforce was predominantly female. They came from every background: schoolteachers, shopgirls, secretaries, widows of the last war. Many had never seen so many papers in one place. Some had never worked full-time before. They learned quickly. Their uniform was plain brown skirts, sensible shoes, rolled-up sleeves. Lipstick was permitted, though frowned upon if too bright. Each woman was issued a desk, a fountain pen, and a thick procedural manual, all correspondence to be initialed in blue ink in the upper right-hand corner. The rules were exhaustive. Every form required 3 signatures. Every calculation required a counter-check. One typist, Irene Feltham, later recalled, "It was dull, yes, but comforting. You felt you were holding chaos at bay with carbon paper." In a world of sirens and uncertainty, bureaucracy became its own kind of shelter. The art of waiting outside, the city shook with nightly raids. But inside the ministry, time seemed to move differently. When the air raid siren sounded, the clerks carried their ledgers to the basement and continued working by torchlight. There were no medals for this, no headlines, just the soft clack of typewriter keys echoing under the city while the bombs fell above. One supervisor joked, "If Hitler ever invades, he'll drown in our paperwork before he reaches the Thames." Letters from the hungry each morning, sacks of mail arrived from across Britain. Pleas, complaints, confessions. "My child's ration book was lost in the evacuation. Please advise. We have not seen sugar in 3 weeks. Is there any to be had? I heard one can get extra butter for nursing." Kendley confirmed before I faint. The clerks read them all. Some answered kindly, some mechanically, depending on how many cups of tea they'd had. But sometimes a letter struck deeper. One from Liverpool, dated February 1941. My husband is at sea. My boy is 7. We live on potatoes. Please don't forget us. A clerk named Margaret Hales kept that letter in her drawer for the rest of the war. She said it reminded her that the numbers meant something. The science of substitution as shortages worsened. The ministry's food research unit began issuing pamphlets. How to cook without eggs, 50 ways with carrots, wartime puddings. The recipes were plain, sometimes strange, but they worked. The goal wasn't delight, it was survival. You couldn't bake happiness, but you could stretch it a bit farther. The clerks themselves became test subjects for the recipes. Lunchtime in the canteen was an exercise in culinary endurance. Woolton pie, a vegetable casserole named after the Minister of Food. Mock goose, potatoes layered with apples and breadcrumbs. Carrot fudge, as dreadful as it sounds. They joked about it endlessly, yet every spoonful was proof of ingenuity. The quiet rivalries, there was gossip, of course. Always gossip. Who was promoted? Who had fainted in the shelter last week? Who was rumoured to be seeing the head clerk from meat control? But beneath the chatter was something more interesting, a quiet competition for meaning. Each clerk wanted to believe her department mattered most. The milk allocation office claimed they kept Britain's bones strong. The bread ration team insisted they fed the nation's backbone. The tea import board simply said, without us, there would be revolt. The pride was modest but fierce. No one wanted to be the one who failed the ledger. The night shift. By late 1940, the ministry introduced night rotations to handle the backlog. Those who stayed after dark described a peculiar stillness. The typewriters slowed, the rooms dimly lit by shaded lamps to avoid drawing bomber attention. Outside, London smouldered inside. Pens scratched steadily through forms that would decide next week's allotments. Sometimes they heard the thud of bombs far away, followed by silence. Then the typing would resume. One clerk wrote later, became nocturnal creatures. Our war was made of paper, not blood, but it left its own kind of scar. The morale file, to keep spirits up, management introduced. The morale file, a collection of cheerful clippings pinned to a notice board. Vegetarians declare victory over sausage shortage. Rationing makes Britain healthier than ever. Carrots improve night vision, ministry says. The last was propaganda, later admitted as a fabrication, designed to disguise radar technology advances. Still, the clerks pretended to believe it. It was easier that way. Order in the midst of chaos. By 1941, Britain's supply lines were strained to breaking. The Battle of the Atlantic had cut off food imports. Ships were sunk weekly. The ministry tightened its belts, literally and figuratively. Yet, somehow it worked. Malnutrition dropped. Waste decreased. People grumbled, but they did not starve. It was the greatest bureaucratic success in British history, and also the least celebrated. No one cheered for the typists who calculated butter rations, or the junior clerk who corrected a decimal that kept Liverpool fed for a month longer. But it was here, in this quiet machinery of diligence, that civilization held its line. The sound of the war from the inside, imagine it for a moment. The drone of bombers above, the whine of the siren, the shuffle of paper in the half-light. A woman at her desk, glasses slipping down her nose, tracing figures in a ledger as the ground shakes faintly beneath her. She keeps writing. She doesn't stop, because if she does, someone somewhere won't eat tomorrow. It's boring, yes. But boring is what keeps a country alive. By the winter of 1941, the ministry's workers had become the backbone of Britain's home front. The invisible army of clerks, pen soldiers, and typists who fought hunger with patience and math. Their names rarely appeared in books or medals, but their fingerprints were on every meal served in wartime Britain. And as the snow fell over London, dusting the rooftops grey, the women in the ministry filed one last stack of papers, exhaled, and sipped their tea. They had no idea the hardest years were still ahead. The sirens no longer frightened anyone. By 1942, they were simply part of the day, like the sound of the milk cart or the wireless humming in the next room. And yet, while the bombs might have fallen less frequently, hunger did not rest. It hovered, quiet and patient, a constant guest at the nation's table. The queue, it began early, often before dawn. Outside the greengrocers on Mayor Street, women stood in thick coats and headscarves, clutching their ration books against the chill. The smell of coal smoke hung in the fog. They waited and waited. Sometimes there was butter, sometimes there was nothing. The queue itself had become an institution. an unspoken ritual of wartime Britain. It was where gossip spread faster than any official notice. Who'd seen bananas for the first time in years? Who'd been spotted with American chocolate? Who might have a cousin in the black market? The women called it Q talk, a strange blend of complaint and camaraderie. You'd think we were queuing for the crown jewels, one woman muttered, stamping her feet against the cold. We are, another said softly, only they melt on toast. The butcher's ledger inside each shop, rationing turned the simplest transaction into a small act of bureaucracy. The butcher, Mr. Fenwick, was both merchant and minor official. Each customer presented their book, opened carefully to the correct page. Mr. Fenwick would inspect the coupons with a ritualistic air, tearing, stamping, and noting down ounces in neat pencil lines. He knew his customers by heart. He also knew who tried to cheat. Once, a woman attempted to reuse a meat coupon with the corner carefully glued back. Mr. Fenwick said nothing, simply handed it back and remarked, "A clever job, Mrs. Dawson. Shame about the date on the back. Even deceit had its etiquette." The butcher's weighing scales gleamed dully under the gaslight, his hands moving with measured precision. Every ounce mattered. Every cut had consequence. It was not commerce anymore. It was administration disguised as shopping. The language of shortage, new words entered the vocabulary. Points, substitutes, allowances. Ordinary people became fluent in bureaucratic speech. Housewives calculated like accountants, learning to convert their desires into numbers. "I can give up my cheese points if you'll swap me your bacon. I've enough tea saved for Christmas, but not enough sugar." The ledger mentality had spread from the ministry's offices into every kitchen. Even recipes changed their grammar. Cookbooks spoke of economies, not indulgence. Measurements were in ounces, not abundance. Each meal became a quiet equation, a balancing of scarcity and imagination. Children of the queue for children. The rationing years felt strangely normal. They grew up thinking that sweets were a seasonal miracle, that oranges were mythic, and that the phrase, "when the war is over," meant some distant paradise of abundance. At school, they learned to share small things, a biscuit divided into quarters, a spoonful of jam spread impossibly thin. Teachers called it building character. One boy, writing in his exercise book in 1943, simply noted, "Mum says we used to have ice cream, but I think she's joking." Rationing raised a generation of quiet pragmatists, people who would later carry that thriftiness into peacetime. They learned not to waste, not to expect too much, and never to trust plenty. The black market, of course, not everyone obeyed the ledger. In the shadowed corners of bombed-out London, another economy flourished. Men with slick hair and trench coats whispered offers behind pubs. "Butter, love. 3 ounces. Proper stuff. No marg. Sugar, if you've got the coupons, or even if you haven't." It was illegal but rarely despised. Even the ration clerks knew about it. Some turned a blind eye. A few participated quietly. A pound of coffee here, a tin of corned beef there. Morality had softened under fatigue. The war had stretched too long for purity. There was a phrase often heard in those years: "If you don't ask, you don't get. If you get, don't tell." The clerk's apartment, meanwhile, the ministry's workers, the same women who rationed the nation, lived under rationing themselves. A typical clerk's flat might contain a single electric ring for cooking, a bed with government-issued blankets, one tin of powdered milk on the shelf labeled for emergency use. Their evenings were quiet. After walking home through the blackout, they might boil a potato, listen to the wireless, and mark their ration coupons for the week ahead. Some kept diaries. One entry from 1942 reads, "Today I authorized an extra milk allowance for expectant mothers. I then went home and had tea without milk." Felt rather absurd. Paper as power in wartime Britain. Paper was more powerful than money. A lost ration book was a disaster, worse than losing a purse. Without it, one could neither buy nor claim food legally. The ministry printed replacements reluctantly after interviews and sworn statements. Fraud was suspected in every loss. There were stories of desperate families forging their own books using candle soot and tracing paper. Even the criminals, it seemed, had adopted the habits of bureaucrats. The shopkeeper's burden. Shopkeepers became civil servants overnight. Each week they submitted returns to the local food office, forms detailing how much butter, meat, or flour they had sold. The paperwork took hours. Failure to complete it correctly could result in fines or suspension of their license. One grocer remarked to a journalist, "I used to sell food. Now I sell arithmetic." Yet, despite the tedium, the shops remained the heart of community life. Behind the counters, small acts of kindness persisted. a few extra scraps for the old widow, a spoonful of dripping for the family with a newborn. Rules were bent quietly, compassionately, a moral greyness painted over the black and white of regulation. The inventive housewife's scarcity bred creativity. Carrot cake replaced sponge cake. Margarine stood in for butter. Mashed potato thickened everything from soups to puddings. The ministry's own pamphlets, distributed free, became wartime bestsellers. Titles like Kitchen Front Recipes and Eating for Victory filled cupboards across the country. They were practical, but also strangely patriotic. West is treason, the leaflets warned. Your bin may feed the enemy. Even the act of scraping a pot clean felt like defiance. A tea without milk, there is an image that often appears in letters from 1943, an almost sacred moment of resignation. Tea without milk. It summed up the era perfectly, something beloved made barely tolerable, yet still ritualized. Men home on leave would sit with their wives, the brown liquid steaming faintly in chipped cups, and joke. At least it's wet. The laughter was tired but real, because even in rationing there was continuity, the small daily comforts that outlasted fear. Rumors of plenty by 1943. Whispers began to spread that the Americans might soon flood Britain with supplies. The G's were already arriving, bringing gum, chocolate, and nylon stockings. To British eyes, they seemed impossibly rich. A single American soldier's lunchbox could hold more sugar than a British household's weekly allowance. It caused a mix of gratitude and envy. Some clerks joked that the war could be won if only the Americans were made to file for rations like everyone else. A system that worked too well. The astonishing thing about Britain's rationing system was not how strict it was, but how efficient. Despite bombings, blockades, and shortages, no major famine occurred. Calorie intake remained surprisingly steady, even improving for some poor families who, before the war, had eaten worse in peacetime. Rationing had become the great social equalizer. The rich lost their privilege of excess, the poor gained a measure of security. It was fairness born of deprivation, equality through monotony. The war without glory. As 1943 drew to a close, the clerks at the ministry began to feel invisible. The war correspondents wrote of heroes and victories, of battles fought in deserts and skies. No one wrote of the women who stamped forms until their wrists ached, or the grocers who counted ounces by candlelight. Yet without them, there would have been no victory at all. They didn't see themselves as heroes, merely as people doing what needed to be done, one dull day at a time. The philosophy of enough by now, rationing had seeped into the national character. People learned a new kind of satisfaction, not from abundance but from enough. Enough to get by, enough to share, enough to keep the ledger balanced. The British people, wary but steady, found dignity in the ordinary act of making do. It wasn't thrilling, it wasn't glorious, but it was survival, the quiet, organized endurance that would see them through the war's last long years. And as 1943 faded into 1944, a new question began to form, not about victory, but about what would come after. If the war ended tomorrow, would Britain even remember how to live without ration books? Would people still measure life by ounces and coupons? Or would they crave the boredom that had somehow become security?